The Bonus Army by Jordan Topping. What exactly is the Bonus Army? Well, the Bonus Army is a huge group of people of around 43,000, let's call them marchers, and about 17,000 of these marchers were actually World War One veterans. So this is basically a huge group of people who are protesting against um, something that they do not feel is right, and I'll get into that in the next slide. But this is taking place during the Great Depression, so that is something that we definitely need to keep in mind. And yeah, let's get on to the next slide. So, what did the Bonus Army want? What were they protesting for? What was going on? So, the last picture I showed you, and this picture is pictures of the Bonus Army doing what they did, protesting. They're protesting for their money that they felt that was owed to them. So, this was a cash payment redemption of their service certificates, which in short means um, basically they were paid every single day for the service that they did during World War One, and they had not been paid this amount. So this bill to actually pay them their bonuses did not come until a little bit after. So they since this is during the Great Depression, the Bonus Army marchers and the veterans, their family members, etc., basically wanted this money immediately because they are pretty much out because of the Great Depression. So here we have a picture of some conflict. So there's a lot of hardship in these camps. And this is a lot of people, 43,000 marchers, as I said previously. So there's conflicts within the marchers, there's conflicts with authorities, as you can see here in the picture, and there's just a lot of um, bad, just negative feelings being tossed around throughout the camp, and so it's causing a lot of conflict. There was actually some casualties from the Bonus Army just events. About 4 people died, and 1,017 people were injured. And I mentioned something about the authorities being involved a lot, and about 70 police were actually injured. So you can kind of see where that came into play. Here we have another picture, and I figured I would touch on the hardships a little bit more. And in this picture, you can see that this man is basically lying under a little hut sort of thing that has his protesting beliefs on it, and it says most of us will be dead by 1945, which is when the Bonus Army was scheduled to get this money. Now this is around 1932 and all this is happening. So, this is what he's saying is that most of us will be dead at this rate by 1945. That's 13 years into the future for these people. He says the years of 1917 and 18 have been forgotten, and so that was probably when he was actually serving. So he really needs this money. He's trying to show how much he needs it, and it's a really good point that there's a lot of hardship going on in the camp already, and by the time it hits 1945, it's just going to be even worse. Alright, so here's a nice news article that I use as one of my primary sources. I thought it was really, really cool and kind of showed how real this actually was at the time. It was definitely in the news a lot. It was one of the headline things that you would see, and I was able to compare this to our present day because we see all types of protests and conflict going on the news and all kinds of things, and it's very similar back then, except this was a little bit more elevated in the hype factor because of the fact that this was not very familiarized as far as the people seeing this sort of thing happen. So here we have a really nice picture, I think, showing kind of just part of the amount of people actually marching. Now, this is a ton of people, and as I said, about 43,000 people were actually involved in this. Now, this included World War One veterans, their families, friends, and whoever else believed in the cause of these marchers. Now, I wanted to put this in perspective because whenever I hear a number, it kind of goes in one ear and flies out the other. So I figured I'd make a nice comparison. Around 430 movie theaters full of people would amount to the Bonus Army's marchers. Now, I just find that really insane, and I thought it was a really nice way to kind of put into perspective on how many people are actually in this. So here we have the camps. They were basically traveling from the West Coast, so up in California, Washington, and they were traveling all the way down to the capital, so down in Washington, D.C. Now, they would pick up more and more people as the march went on, as they passed certain states, etc., which means the camps grew, they had to hold more people, and they kind of got worn out as it went on. Now, as you can see, the conditions aren't very good. Um, Even with the circumstances of all these people and the fact that they're constantly needing to be transported and always on the move, plus the factor that is the Great Depression and there's barely any money to go around. So you can kind of see why these conditions would be pretty rough and not necessarily the best living conditions. Now, did they ever get paid? Yes, the Bonus Army did finally get paid, and it was a good day. They were actually paid a little bit earlier than 1945, which was very helpful for the people marching because, of course, they would not want to stay there any longer than they already were. But one thing I want to touch on real quickly before I go into my frequently asked questions slides is the fact that there was a presidency change, and there was a presidency change, um, basically from President Hoover to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Now there was a very big difference between the two. President Hoover kind of waved off the Bonus Army. He did not find it to be on his top priority list and kind of just ignored them and kind of let them continue to protest. There was a really large difference, though, when FDR was actually appointed president. He kind of took them into consideration and started paying attention to them a little bit more, and he was able to kind of solve the problem, which is definitely a morale booster for the community around Washington, D.C., and for his presidency in general. So this was a really nice thing that FDR was able to do. He was kind of able to take them into consideration and give them kind of a chance at what they wanted. So now I'll be moving on to my frequently asked questions slide. Alright, so my first question I'd like to talk about that I got from my classmates were how long did World War I last for? Now, World War I lasted for about 40 years, and this was a pretty gruesome war and was followed by World War II, obviously. Next question I got was how old were the soldiers? Now, these soldiers were a very wide range of age because of the fact that some of them actually snuck into the army due to their high want to fight. So it was anywhere from around 16 all the way up to around 70. So very wide range, a lot of people lying about their age. And by the time that the Bonus Army actually came around, some of them at the oldest may have been even into the 80s who were marching, but maybe not too many of them were actually marching just because of that age. Next question I got was what year were they actually given their money? They were actually given their money in 1938, so that is a pretty good good amount of years early. So they were marching for around 60 years, and they got it about 7 years early. So kind of met right in the middle there, which is not too bad. Another question I got was why weren't they paid directly after the war? They were not paid directly after the war for a couple of reasons. Number one, they needed some money to basically pay off all the expenses from World War I itself, such as, factories, building certain materials, etc., etc. And another thing was the bill wasn't actually passed to give these soldiers money until a couple years after the war actually ended. Another question I got was what was the government's money being used for? At the time of the Bonus Army March, it was the Great Depression, which means, number one, they barely had any money to use, and second, the money was pretty much being used to keep the money they actually did have was basically keeping the whole country afloat. Another question I got was were they actually promised this money, as in when the soldiers signed up for the war, were they guaranteed this money, or how did that work? They were guaranteed this money. It was kind of part of their contract, if you will, and this money was promised to them when they enlisted. So, uh, they did take time to pass the actual bill to get the money, as far as like how much they would get and when they would get it. But this money was promised from the very start. Um, Another question I got was, were they actually satisfied with the outcome of this? Now, this would be kind of, well, really, really opinionated, due to the amount of people who were actually marching. I'm sure a lot of them were pretty annoyed that they had to protest for so many years to actually get this money, but it is probably a lot better than getting it in 1945, which is a very, very long time, 13 years later, um, from when they actually started the march. So I'm sure it was kind of a middle of the road feeling, because of the fact that it did take some time, but at the same time, it didn't take until 1945. So those are some of the most frequently asked questions I got. I really appreciate you watching my video. I hope you did enjoy and learn something. Make sure that you kind of take into account what some of these people marched for. And yeah, thanks for watching. I'll have my sources in my next slide.